Event in here before. We were just talking about.
Good evening, everyone. There we are. See,
Trying to help.
There's a member of Parliament who knows how to get attention there from plenty of experience. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Unhung Club for our second Future of Conservatism debate. As some of you may know, I'm Sebastian Payne, Director of Onward, and we're delighted to be here tonight talking about reclaiming the realignment. And that obviously we've just come off the back of some local election results, one or two of you may be aware of, and we'll be discussing that. But what we're looking at is some longer-term political trends. We're having a look at what's happened to British politics since 2016 for the voting coalitions between both parties. We'll be talking about a couple of wars, the red wars or the blue wars, or as one Tory strategist said to me, you and your effing wars, mate. And you can guess with a bad accent who that might have been. But as you can, I'm delighted to be joined by a very illustrious panel to be discussing this. We are very sadly one down, though, that James Kanagasorium cannot join us tonight, that he's been not very well, and I can guarantee you he's not flaking because he actually sent me a picture as evidence of the norovirus. But that is all the reason he did not, in his words, take 3 Imodium and come tonight. But I have some thoughts from James that I will be feeding into the debate. But we are delighted to be welcomed by 3 wonderful people who've written, experienced, and thought about the realignment that's taken place since 2016 more than anyone else. On my far right, not politically obviously, is Eddie Hughes, who's the MP for Warsaw North since 2017 and was one of the first bricks in the Red Wall, as I wrote about in a book that I'm going to shoehorn into this conversation as much as possible, when Eddie won your seat for the first ever time and has returned it since then. We have Rachel Wolfe, who is the founding partner, director of Public First, all those things, which is one of the finest polling and public affairs companies within Westminster. Rachel also was co-author of the 2019 Conservative Manifesto, as she's absolutely not tired of hearing whatsoever. And finally, on our left, we have Tom McTague, who is the political editor of Unheard, and many of you will know him from his essays on Politico and The Atlantic, many of them looking at how the realignment has changed within British politics since then. Now, we're going to run this for about 40 minutes or so while we will chat, but then we'll have plenty of times for questions. Thank you to everyone who's joining us online. I'm not sure we have got a way of taking questions online, but I don't know, use telepathy or something and they can enter the room, and I'm sure you will have very similar thoughts on that. But I'd like to begin with the local elections, Rachel, because I think we could call the results suboptimal for the Conservative Party, at least if the expectations management was anything to go by. But a lot of commentators have looked at what happened and saying that the realignments that people like you and myself have written about has been unaligned, that actually, in fact, politics has gone back to its traditional divides, that Labour's winning from the Conservatives in the north, in the red wall, you've got the Lib Dems challenging in the blue wall, and does the Conservative Party face this potential issue of abandoning both walls and being without a wall?
So I think it's great that we're starting with the now, even though I think most of this is looking at the future, because I think we quite often do elide these two things of why is the Conservative Party in a complete mess now versus whether there are forces that are going to cause it problems in the future. And my view is that the reason we're in a mess right now is not because the realignment has unaligned or because demographics have changed, because to a very real extent the Conservatives deserve to be in a mess right now. Because everybody hates them, and everybody hates them for 2 core reasons. Because the economy is an utter mess, and they feel, and indeed are, significantly poorer than they were a few years ago. And because they are terrified that if they or their grandmother is dying in the street, the ambulance won't come in time. Now, that's a slight simplification, but only a slight simplification. And the reason I stress that is because this isn't really about different coalitions of voters. Everybody cares about the economy, and everyone cares about the NHS. And if the core things you rely upon a government to deliver or make stable have disappeared, and you think that they could do better, and I'll come back to this, it's not surprising that they will go for whichever party seems the most credible alternative at the moment, which I think is broadly what happened in the local elections. So I should say, I think this mess is despite of, not because of the current Prime Minister, who is, I think, trying very, very hard to overcome some of the challenges. But I think we, we people in the Conservative Party, in the movement, MPs, have to recognise that voters have every right to be really quite angry right now and very, very, very worried. And until you tackle those universal issues, the secondary question of which coalition you're going after is an irrelevance. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. And underlying that, and I know James Kanagasorian would probably have made a point along these lines if he were here, we do sometimes exaggerate the differences between these groups of voters. There's actually very little evidence that anyone votes on trans or woke issues. There's actually not that much evidence that huge numbers of people vote on cultural issues more broadly, although there's a sort of small significant population that cares about things like illegal immigration. The thrust of the 2019 manifesto, leaving aside Brexit, which was important, very important, was broadly, the alternative is fundamentally unsafe and will mess everything up. And you can trust us to not completely screw up the economy and to fund public services. Like, these are not complex messages, and one of the reasons that you could bring together a broad coalition was because they were not complex messages. So I think we forget that at our peril. I will happily come on to the kind of longer-term challenges, which I think do exist. But to me, this is the most important thing. Fix the NHS to the extent that you can. Allow voters who currently think that the Conservative and the government could do much more and is choosing not to understand the efforts you are making, deliver, and then you can talk about which coalition you're going after.
It feels like in some ways that a phrase that I've heard sort of bouncing around ways that almost economics is back in a way, in the sense that people are very focused on not just public services, but the state of the economy overall here, because if people aren't feeling wealthier and more prosperous, then that's obviously a barrier to voting for the Conservatives in a fifth historic election. Yeah,
and again, I think we can make this too abstract. It's not the sort of sense that the economy in general should be growing. It's, I can't afford a pack of butter. Like, I think we can, again, overcomplicate this massively. People are terrified that they can't afford the heating. I think the Conservatives have not done a brilliant job, although they spent a huge amount of money on it, conveying quite how much money they've spent on this. And so their life day to day feels really quite miserable. Focus groups are saying exactly the same thing they were saying a year ago and 6 months ago. Nothing's changed. That's what they're worried about. And actually, it could be a lot worse, because if they thought that Starmer was better, the polls would be a lot worse than they are today.
Well, we're going to come on to all that at this debate in a moment. But Eddie, what's your take on what did you pick up on the doorstep during the local elections in your patch? And do you agree with Rachel's analysis of what the government needs to do to try and reclaim some of those 2019 voters?
Well, it feels to me it's the second time that I wish the rest of the country was experiencing my personal experience of an election. So when I got elected in 2017, I came down to Westminster with a very small bunch of colleagues and had just about everybody talking about what a disaster the general election was. And obviously I'm walking around with a big smile on my face saying, how can you possibly call it a disaster? We won Walsall North for the first time in 40 years. Surely that's a success. And I was obviously accompanied by people like Ben Bradley and Lee Rowley, who were probably feeling pretty much the same sense of success. And what happened, same thing again in this election. I've been knocking doors. We've worked incredibly hard from that initial victory in 2017. We'd worked so hard to get to that point. It wasn't success just at that one point. We'd come within 1,000 votes of winning the seat previously. So when we got it, as a team, we really dug in. And going around in these elections, I think my reception personally on the doorstep, the reception for councillors on the doorstep has been incredible. But just let me make 2 points that sit behind that, or perhaps 1 point in particular. So one of the first things I did when I got elected was I got a whisper that we were going to be bidding for funding for our local hospital for a new A&E department, urgent care centre. And I utterly owned that project. I got my constituents to lobby for it. I raised it in PMQs. I spoke to Matt Hancock. When we got the money, I was on that building site just about as often as the bricklayers who were working on it, and we owned every minute of it. When the Conservative Party did some polling, for me, as a new MP, one of the bits of feedback that they got was that I was so heavily associated with it that when Carillion went bust, they wanted to know who I would be appointing if there was any problem with the contractor on our hospital. So given the money that has been spent by this government, sometimes we are absolutely not getting the credit for the cash that we have spent. I'll give you another example. So we have spent, we've all talked about the 20,000 police that we've had. That's cost us £3.6 billion. The National Audit Office tells us to this point. But do people feel safer? Well, we are not responsible for the mechanism that delivers their safety. But what I feel we've seen is with the appointment, for example, of Stephen Watson, who became the Chief Constable of Manchester while they were failing. He's had 2 years. He's dragged them out of special measures by saying he's going to make sure that his officers attend properties where there have been burglaries. He's going to stop being so woke. So is the government getting all of the credit for the cash that it's spending and the good thing that it's doing? Absolutely not. £3.8 billion on levelling up, 216 projects. Do we feel like we're getting the warmth for that? So there's a mixed picture of what's going on. We're not getting any of the credit for the good stuff that we've done, but we're getting all of the blame for other things, and you would say perhaps rightly so, when people are concerned that if they ring 999, they're not going to get an ambulance. But for us personally, in Walsall, in the Black Country, Sandwell, where they won a number of seats against a backdrop of just a few years ago, having no councillors at all there. So we've got a mixed picture of success. And I feel, for me personally and parochially, in Walsall, it's because we've maxed out on pushing the Conservative message associated with any good things that have been going on in that town.
And just this question about claiming credit for things, because Rachel mentioned the energy supports package, huge sums of money that were put out there, and there was a couple of other things going on at that time that we won't dwell on, but that may have meant that people weren't looking at the good economic things the government was trying to do then. But is this an issue with modern politics about trying to get these messages across? Is it a kind of very day-to-day pragmatic thing? Because, you know, you mentioned all these projects, Eddie, which are completely true, that whenever people say to me, what's levelling up done for me? I say, well, look at literally the hundreds of projects through 2 rounds of levelling up. Not all of them have been built or spade in the ground, but they are there. They are real, and there's another round of levelling up funding coming, but no one seems to want to listen or do to it. Something quite badly is going wrong there.
Well, I think part of the problem is sometimes we, the kind of political class, because we know things, we assume the public know them. But I have found, going back to my hospital story, that you really do need to return to a message again and again until it gets repeated back to you. And sometimes either A, the government doesn't have the time or the focus to do that, or B, it doesn't have the bandwidth because it's dealing with something else. But that's partly down to my colleagues. It is all of our responsibility to be individual ambassadors for the government in our own constituencies and amplifying that message. And that's hard, and it takes effort, and we all need to take that responsibility, including my colleagues who are sitting on big majorities and have been in place for some time. We all need to do the work of banging the drum and sharing the message.
Now, Tom, I want to come to you on the local elections before we move on to the longer-term trends. Now, as a surprise to absolutely no one, when the results came through, it took about 4 hours before the briefing started to the Daily Telegraph saying it's time to bring back Boris Johnson. Someone actually said we need to bring back Liz Truss, which was an interesting electoral strategy. But I think, you know, when we're talking about what happened in 2019 politics since then, a lot of it is very personally associated with the former Prime Minister. And again, you've written extensively on this. When you look at those results, how much of that is a result of the chaos of the last year that we've seen with the change of party leaders? How much does it do with Rachel's point about simply public service and things not feeling like they're working? And how much of it's Eddie's point about just not actually getting the message through about what the government is trying to do?
I must say, I think I'm more with Rachel on this, that I think the good projects where they are, you can bang the drum as much as you like, but the overall picture is so dire that I just can't see how that will make a difference. They'll just be washed away. The reality for people is that they're poorer than they were, and that public services are worse than they were. So, you know, the levelling up funds, you know, doing up a poor town in the northeast or in the West Midlands, I just don't think people are going to be grateful for that, and in a way, nor should they be. Like that's the job of a government, and the Conservative Party is there to make people, protect the country's wealth, protect people's wealth, and to maintain public services, and it's not done that, and that's your fundamental problem. In terms of the realignment, I also agree. I think there's an element of overcomplicating it. You know, I'm from just outside Darlington in the constituency of Sedgefield, and I went back and I was travelling recently, and I just don't think there's that much difference between Darlington and Swindon or Walsall. Like, I don't think people are like fundamentally different in Darlington than they are in Swindon, with different priorities. They voted Conservative because there's a relatively large sort of lower middle class who bought into the message, and they were more concerned about the Labour Party and the threat to their wealth than the Conservative Party. And it seems to me actually there's a sort of deep continuity to the Conservative Party and its appeal in the country. For various reasons, I've been spending a long time sort of digging into Disraeli and the origins of the Conservative Party, and it seems to me that the Conservative Party is successful when it establishes the same coalition of voters sort of over and over again. I think Disraeli would call it like the monarch and the multitude. Like the top and the bottom have always been necessary for the Conservative Party. They've always succeeded when upper working class people, lower middle class people support them, seen as the country party or the patriotic party. I think Disraeli called, in opposition to what he called like this Venetian oligarchy of northern millocracy and all of it. I mean, when I was reading those phrases, I just thought of like the CBI today. Like so the continuity is something that I pick up on. So I sort of feel that the Boris and to some extent Theresa May coalition that was being assembled in those years between 2016 and 2019 was the Conservative Party going back to what its traditional coalition of voters. And I don't see what choice you've got. Like, that's the coalition you have to assemble if you're going to stand any chance of winning. Disraeli had to deal with the middle classes as well. He had to go back on his principles, what he fought against free trade and had to accept it to try and bring the middle classes on board to assemble that coalition. And you're going to have to do the same thing again. You're going to have to bring the middle classes who are a bit concerned with the party since Brexit. You're going to have to bring those on board. But the playbook is simple, I think. And the problem is you've got to start making people feel wealthier again, because right now I just don't see what option they've got other than to vote against you.
Now, if you think sort of pre-2016, I think what is interesting, if you look at the coalition that David Cameron cobbled together in 2010, 2015, and my personal views in 2015, it was the maximum possible extent you could get by pushing that coalition.
Yeah.
You know, winning Battersea, for example, that's a seat that I don't think anyone thinks is going to go back to the Conservatives, you know, for the foreseeable future, if ever, because of how that realignment has changed. But clearly, what happened after 2016 was losing some of those seats. I think we saw that in the 2017 election when, Eddie, you picked up your seat, Battersea went to Labour, and, you know, yours has got stronger, Labour's got stronger for Labour, Battersea's got stronger for the Labour Party. But what's often missed is that in every election, the party's built up votes. It's built up more votes and it's widened its voter base, losing some on the edges, but gradually picking up more and more stuff. So I think there is a lot of people who like to say it's either or, but that's not really the case, and that's your point. And I think it's also, if you want to throw in some more historical names, this is Lord Randolph Churchill's Tory democracy, the kind of, as you said, the top and bottom concept. And a lot of that came through to the fruition with the Primrose League in that era as well, which was trying to widen the concept of Toryism and the Conservative Party into working class England.
Yeah, and then Balfour and Macmillan and Thatcher as well, to some extent. She won working class voters in a way that David Cameron couldn't, right? So, you know, it seems to me, again, that it's the continuity, it's there, but they're currently suffering. I mean, I think the local elections are most interesting, and why isn't the Conservative Party more dead than it is right now? Like, Keir Starmer is a plausible Prime Minister. He's not radical in any sense. Rachel Reeves does not appear to be a great threat to the middle classes of England with her economic policy. They want to pump more money into public services. Those are the two issues you were talking about. And yet, the polling that I think the Conservative Party is being given internally suggests that there's still a chance that Labour will not win a majority. Now, why? Why is that? There is still some residue of hope for the Conservative Party.
Well, let's try and mine that residue, Rachel, and move away from the local elections and into what is this realignment. I just want to think about what we're talking about here, because, as I said, what we saw in 2015, 2017, 2019 was a gradual widening of the coalition, but the makeup of that coalition has changed, certainly. If you look at, the ABC 1 and C to D voters, to use those broad categories of whether people are classified as working class voters or not, it is clear that after the Brexit referendum, many of those voters that left the Labour Party to go to UKIP went through this process and they eventually came to the Conservatives, and it seems, based on the current polls, some have now gone full circle and gone back to the Labour Party. How much realignment do you think there was post-Brexit, and how much of it was just continual, as I said, coalition building?
So it seems to me unlikely that David Cameron Osborne, on the broad thrust of their policy agenda and messaging, would have gained the kind of coalition and election result of 2019 or 2017. So to that extent, yes, there seems to me a genuine realignment. And James Frayne coined the sort of just about managing idea. It was then replaced by the red wall idea. But it's broadly similar, that there's a group of voters, which is exactly what Tom was talking about, who are not poor, they earn a decent wage. Often they'll have housing, they'll be older, but who were culturally Labour, more attached to Labour, partly because of public services. They tend to be quite anti-austerity, who have been attracted by the message that was offered in 2017 and 2019. That, I think, is a different question from what's happening to them now. So if you look at the sort of Conservative 2019 coalition, actually, broadly, those people who voted Conservative are not shooting back to Labour. A relatively small proportion of them are shooting back to Labour. A much higher, twice as many are going to don't know. They don't like the Conservatives, but it's not obvious who they want to vote for. And about the same proportion, slightly less, in some of the polling at least, have gone to Labour, are going to sort of Reform. So they're kind of peeling off the Conservatives. But it's not that they're shooting back to Labour. Why is that? Actually, I think a very significant part of that is leadership and, to an extent, policy. So what we hear in focus groups all the time is, I don't trust a word Keir Starmer says. I don't believe it's going to be better. I feel poorer, but I still have to feel like if I vote for someone else, it might be marginally better than what I've got right now.
Just on that, so this is obviously a lot of messaging from the Conservative leadership about Mr. Flip-Flops, Softy, whatever the phrases are we hear at PMQ.
That is cutting through.
That has cut through.
Yeah, that has cut through. I'm not sure it's because of the Conservative Party, but it has cut through to a significant extent. So they feel no enthusiasm for an alternative. I think one of the saddest things when you go and talk to people around the country is you get not anger, but sort of depressed apathy, which is a really miserable experience. So I think that's why they're not switching back in droves. And I guess to Tom's point, it's not obvious to me that they are actually promising anything radically different or more on public services. They're promising one chunk of funding on green. But they are themselves so terrified of losing this next election, then they're not offering anything obviously different. I find it very hard to name serious electoral differences on policy terms that Labour are offering instead of the Conservatives. So sorry, I'm not entirely answering your question, Seb. Yes, I think there was a genuine realignment, as in there were a bunch of voters that were picked up over the last several years that were not completely available to Cameron and Osborne. I agree that they'd basically tapped out. They are culturally and economically and in terms of public services somewhat different. They are the only credible, serious majority coalition.
Why is that? Sorry, Tom made that point as well, but why is it that you think they're the only viable coalition?
Well, the alternative coalition is to think that you can get the kind of traditional sort of Surrey Conservatives, want a better term, and then you can sweep up a vast proportion of the young graduates and educated people of this country. Even then, I think there's a sort of geographical challenge to that. It just seems to me utterly implausible that you could do that. In fact, there's a much greater tension between the Surrey Conservatives and the young graduates over things in housing than there is between the Surrey Conservatives and the people who vote for Eddie. Much greater policy tension. It seems to me that that is mostly driven by a combination of long-term demographic challenges and also that just lots of people who are engaged in Conservatives are kind of youngish graduates and wish the party was a bit more for them. Tough. I just don't see that it's credible as a serious majority right now.
And I think one of the things you often come to Eddie in a moment, Rachel, is that in politics, you do have to choose. You can't just appeal everything to everyone the whole time. And it's a very easy instinct to just say, hey, why can't we just, speak to every part of the country? That's not how you win general elections. And it's not how you can govern the country. So you're saying is a very stark choice. There's either the realignment coalition, if we will call it that, of a more working class coalition across the country, or there is no coalition.
Yeah, with, the point that one can overdo this because broadly people want a functioning economy and NHS. I think when you look back at, say, Tony Blair and the early stuff that Blair did, it's really striking how aggressive his dividing lines were and how willing he was to take on certain groups, the viciousness with which he talked about the teacher unions at various points. He was willing to do this. I think we slightly lost this, and it is bad electorally. It's also terrible for government.
So on that side now...
I'm dominating.
Do you think the Conservative coalition is too wide at the moment?
No. I do not think the problem is that we had an 80-seat majority. I think the problem is we didn't use it.
We could come on to many
especially
reasons
as you're credited with part of it.
I was going to say, not saying this is your fault.
If only we'd only just won. No, I don't find that.
Sorry, Seb, can we just back the truck up for 10 seconds to say, surely the public are seeing that at some point Keir was stonkingly ahead in the polls. The Conservative Party was doing everything within our power to make it easy for him. We were literally tearing ourselves apart. People couldn't phone an ambulance and expect it to turn up. I mean, conditions just couldn't have been worse. And yet the polls are narrowing. Rishi is catching him with regard to who would make the most competent leader. And so surely there is an element of the public seeing this guy had the best opportunity in the world to seal the deal with the electorate and prove that he could step in and offer answers to those questions. Maybe he's missed that boat?
He might have, but I want to get this. Is that because of a tactical thing, or is that because of a more innate instinct among voters to this issue about who stands for them, their economic and social values, or is it simply just the fact...
Well, your own polling, I appreciate that was from September last year, is telling us that people have moved easily into the don't know column, but they're hovering in the don't know column. They haven't jumped to Labour, and the stress testing that has been done with people looking at various things about how people track in the run-up to a general election, not being asked the question of who are you going to vote for, but that question, who do you think is most likely to win the next general election? We're seeing some strange things going on in the narrowing there. So there's certainly no confidence among the electorate. And I think, as well, very helpful for us politically, Keir being challenged about whether he would form a coalition with the Lib Dems and not being able to answer that question. I bet he's perplexed as to how he's now in the position of being asked whether he'd form a coalition compared to how far he was ahead in the polls previously. And I fully appreciate that he cautioned his MPs to say this isn't going to last. But it's certainly not going to last, buddy, if you don't take this opportunity to make a strong pitch to the electorate and tell them what you're going to do. And I appreciate there's a risk with that, some considerable distance from an election, but by the same token, Tony Blair was being brave and bold, and that's what's going to capture people's imagination.
I'm going to come back to the coalition thing with Tom, but going to your patch, Eddie, what was the reason you were able to win Walsall North, apart from obviously your personal fantastic campaigning skills with the hospital?
That was a powerful case. I think a combination of things. People feel that we care about them and are talking about the things they care about. So when I talk about things like the police, and we have, for example, opened a custody block in the police station in my constituency, which means the police can arrest people and put them straight in prison, whereas sometimes there was talk about them not arresting people after kind of 2 o'clock in the afternoon because it meant they'd have to drive some distance somewhere else. So what does this mean? It means that they're seeing more police on the street. We've had some dreadful incidents of knife crime recently. And I thought it was slightly pejorative of you to describe levelling up as doing up a town. But when you've just got a £36 million new A&E department that's got access to GP care, that really does make a significant difference to people. And when they care about the NHS and they know that service is available, I'm telling you, they're pleased about it.
Yeah, if I could just very quick to add to this, like, if they'd actually done the 40 hospitals in the manifesto, I think they'd be in a better shot.
Tommy, come back on those 2 points.
I just don't think that should be a levelling up fund responsibility. It should be for the Department of Health, build the hospitals, have more funding for the NHS if that's your policy. But the levelling up fund I think it's such a strange beast. It's a pot of money controlled by the Treasury that people then have to apply for and plead how poor their town is or how much it needs. It needs this various thing. And when I was going through Durham and the Tees Valley, there was sort of more resentment about it than support for it because they felt that they didn't get what they deserved, or the neighbouring town got more money than them, and it was all this political infighting. And I just ultimately, it's not going to level up the country. That's my fundamental problem with it. Everybody knows that the levelling up fund is not going to level up the country. It's going to make things a bit better in poorer areas, but Darlington is not going to get wealthier, as wealthy as Cambridge, because you move Treasury North into Darlington. It's just not. Darlington and the North East need more big private sector companies there. That's what it needs. Everyone knows that, but there is. I just don't see much of a strategy from the Conservative Party or the Labour Party to change that fact.
I think the problem is that levelling up is trying to reverse decades of what I would describe as wrong decision-making in Whitehall in terms of where investment goes, where public money is spent, and where transport and critical infrastructure is done. And you can do some of the stuff that Eddie talked about that will help a local area. But there is also a flip side of this, that when I did my book on the Red War, it's been 10 minutes before I mentioned it, and I remember I sat down with Tony Blair and we were talking about Sedgefield, and I relayed to him this point that I picked up from lots of people there who said, you know, we had an MP, not just the MP, but the guy was the Prime Minister for 13 years. What did we get for it? What did we get for it? Well, how did our lives change? And if you asked Mr. Blair, he can rattle you off a list of 20 projects of hospitals, of schools, of roads, of all that stuff he did. And the same was true for every single Labour MP who lost their seat. You know, I remember doing the same thing with Caroline Flint, with Phil Wilson in Sedgefield. All these MPs who lost, they all did things that could be classified as levelling up funds, and yet it didn't work when it came to the election. They were blue in the face about all the infrastructure, but when it came to the issue of values and that national message Rachel was talking about, they just said they went with their heart on this, not what their head was telling them on what was happening on the ground.
It's not just values, though, is it? Because all of those projects are great, but should voters be eternally grateful for whichever politician whichever government builds a road or a school or a hospital? The fact is, the northeast of England is basically as poor as Poland. You know, Birmingham is nowhere near as wealthy as Munich or Amsterdam or Dublin or Copenhagen or any of these cities. We know the basic problem in Britain. There's basically the wealth is in the southeast, and much of the country is poor, just by standard European levels of wealth, let alone American levels of wealth. And no government of, Tony Blair and all the funding that he put into city centres and all the rest, this government, no government has tackled that. It seems it's far too deep a structural problem. And that's I suppose, my cynicism with the Levelling Up Fund. The challenge is enormous. It's over, I think economists talk about the difference between the North and South in England is pretty much on the same level as West and East Germany. And yet the amount of money that we're putting into it is pitiful compared to what the Germans put in it. And even the Germans couldn't really deal with the problem of East-West Germany. They still haven't done it. So I just don't feel like we're being honest about the scale of the problem.
Now, Rachel, I'm going to bring in the ghost of James Canagasorium here. He's still very much alive.
We don't actually agree on quite a lot,
No, I'm going to put some of his points to you on this, which is that, first of all, he made the point to me that, first of all, about 45% of the country's population is London in the South East, and he posed this issue. Are we focusing too much on a realignment? And this, I guess, goes to your thing, that there are some, you categorise blue or red, or working class, middle class, but in fact, people have a broad set of aspirations of what they want from their country and from their government. And by focusing too much on where the electoral coalition is, it's actually an unhelpful conversation?
Well, I guess I would split that into three parts. I think top line, as I said at the beginning, I would agree with James that there's a lot that people have in common. And I talked about the economy and the NHS. And broadly, if you can find things that 70% of people agree with, or 80%, then you're a good spot. So broadly, I agree with that. While there are very significant differences on age and class, and education and income in this country, so that there are substantial differences between people, though not quite as large as in some other countries. So you still do have to make choices about what coalition you're going after. I think it is a fair challenge that we have made that very geographical in our narrative. And I think that's just simply a function of, A, what's flipped, but also that we are a first past the post system. So we look at places, and that doesn't seem to me a bad thing. So I suppose I think about types of people, and many of those types of people flipped in the Red Wall in 2019. But what you're really going after is a type of person. But there are big differences between those types of people. That's then slightly different from what do you then do for those people once you've won? Because the real challenge that we've had is that we had an 80-seat majority, and then for some very understandable reasons, COVID, etc., and some really not very understandable reasons, because we've had several prime ministers who keep changing our mind about what we're trying to do, so it's not surprising that we never get anything done. We haven't really got that much to show for that 80-seat majority and what we promised. And I think we very clearly said to the voters that shifted, many of whom were concentrated in new seats, that we were the change candidates, that things were going to be better and different, and that also inspired much of the Brexit vote. And that's what's... maybe people feel there has been change, but it's because we've gone backwards. The reason I was always more of a fan of the lower level levelling up stuff, which I bundle together as high streets, antisocial behaviour, relatively low-level crime, town centres, hanging baskets. Now, I got a lot of criticism for hanging baskets. The reason I mentioned hanging baskets is people kept bringing them up in focus groups. They were like, that town's got hanging baskets. You can tell that town's a decent shop. So I gleefully put it in, and then I've been mocked for it ever since.
I wasn't mocking at all.
When you are dealing with a very low-trust population who basically think that all politicians are lying bastards, whatever they do, no one's going to make anything better, you can't turn around to them and say, hey, guys, there's this 70-year journey. Would you just go with me? Because why on earth would they listen to you? And so my view was always that you had to show momentum and fast improvements on the ground so that people stuck with you with the longer term and more serious challenges of public service delivery and economic regeneration. And I think what has gone wrong, in my view, with the sort of levelling up, aside from the fact that I think we haven't gone as far on the big things, devolution, transport, as we could, is we've just been quite slow. A lot of the stuff hasn't appeared. A lot of the things that should have been a one-year job are sort of 4 years and counting. And I think one of the tragedies of what's happened for, again, some good reasons, some bad, when I compare the last few years to the period when I was involved from 2010 in the coalition doing school reform, because we're just really slow. We don't produce stuff.
But this comes back to our favourite topic again of Whitehall and state reform, which is a whole other separate conversation, which we may be covering in a future of Conservatism debate. But, Eddie, I just want to look at the future viability of this coalition we've been talking about, because this coalition, in its age demographic, is older, and obviously we are getting older as a country. But as much research has shown, that my generation, the millennials, are the first generation in history who are not becoming more right-wing as they get older. If you go all the way back to the First World War, all those generations, as they buy houses, might have something to do with it. They have families, secure jobs. Each thing makes them a bit more conservative. That's not happening with the millennials. If we're sort of betting the house on this particular demographic and acknowledging that young people are just never going to vote for us in centred around the city places, isn't that eventually going to run out of luck at some point, though? Like, how do you develop and keep renewing that? Because to Tom's earlier point, the Conservative Party has some consistent ideas of the coalition, but it does always renew its outlook and ideas to keep a new coalition forming, every generation or so.
Well, I think there are two things. So, first of all, housing feels like just about the most problematic thing for us to tackle. I was rereading Oliver Letwin's paper about build-out rates and had forgotten, because I'm a Midlands MP, the problems of build-out rates in London being half those of the rest of the country. I mean, we've got an awful lot of permissions that have been granted, and we should be finding a way to deliver those. And it's probably not surprising that young people are feeling very disenfranchised in London, not least then having to move further and further out of this area in order to find somewhere they can afford. So one way or another, we need to grasp that nettle and find a way to build more homes and start delivering, regardless of which political party is running the show. And the question of the age demographic is just problematic in as much as I think Onward's own polling showed that Conservative vote, you're most likely to vote Conservative. It's gone from something like 43 to 57. So it's been a dramatic increase, and as you say, we're losing them. So I guess it was somehow we need to find an offer that appeals to young people. I would say Tony Blair was telling everybody that 50% of people should be going to university, and certainly in towns like Walsall, that's absolutely not appropriate. And things like T-levels or apprenticeships are a good start in terms of addressing those problems and making them young people appreciate that there is access to training that will help them get jobs. And we also need to kind of deliver on the green jobs, any jobs that are associated with net zero projects and things like that, and try and make sure there's an equitable distribution of where they are delivered around the country. But we need to have an offer to young people, and I feel like we're only getting started and we've got 18 months to an election.
Do you think, Rachel, we do know? Do you think, like, actually, because if classic example, take the pensions triple lock, for example. That is a policy that everyone loves to talk about, and I can't look forward to the next 18 months when we'll be talking about the next election campaign. If you wanted to appeal to more younger people, you would bin the triple lock and put that money into housing or something else. But that comes at a cost, which is there'll be older people who will say, well, actually, you're no longer representing me. So how much does this coalition need younger people?
I think this is the dilemma, right? Because at any moment in time, it's irrational for you to dump your existing voters, of whom there are still a lot more old people than any other group, for younger ones. So you sort of hope that when it comes time where the numbers go against you, you can switch and you won't have so much permanent brand damage that it's over. And I don't think any of us know the answer to that. So no, I mean, on a pure electoral arithmetic basis, it would be completely mad right now to say, you know what, I don't care about the over 65s anymore, I'm going after the young people. It'd be insane. So then what do? You try and find ways to, and this is a theory, I don't think we have proof of this, but I think it's a persuasive theory. You try and find ways to allow more younger people. It's great being a Conservative because I'm still a young Conservative, I think now, which is awesome. Younger people to have a stake, to have wealth, to have assets. And we have not managed to do that. In fact, we've gone backwards. What fascinates me is that Labour isn't really doing it either.
It wasn't a Mr Corbyn.
Yes, this Labour is not doing
Yes.
either. A credible Labour government. So Labour could say, I'm just concreting over Cambridgeshire. That's it. There are going to be several million houses there. Like, what are they going to lose from their electoral coalition? But they're not. So there also seems to me a generic lack of willingness to tackle this across the political parties.
Yeah, Tom, I want to bring you in on this age question as well. And also, because the fact is that as the national population is getting older, and we are about to go through this sort of almost 10 to 20-year period where there is a big section of the population who have got very expensive houses that have had their assets inflated through the economic good times, and that's almost going to just drop off a cliff, as people move through the age cohorts. And I just wonder whether you think, is there, where do you see that balance? Because as Rachel said, you can't just ignore young people, but nor do you want to cut off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah, I recently worked on a piece that was about a phenomenon known as Dino, and I don't know if anybody has come across it, but I learned about it online. It was like this online meme about this person called Dino, and he's this generic bloke who's about sort of 35, and he's not poor, he's not rich, He owns his own house. He has his car on in the drive on a lease. He's badly affected by interest rates, but he goes to Spain on holiday. And this is the floating voter. And actually, he's Mondeo man. He's the same kind of character that's always been the floating voter. And I was speaking to a pollster about this, because there's some people think this person and the family unit are the key to the next election or to the Conservative Party's hopes, because they own their home, but they own it in Darlington or Bishop Auckland or Swindon. It's not, it's not a vastly expensive house. You can afford it. The mortgages isn't vast. And actually, the question this pollster came back with, is it Dino who's the key to the next election, or is it Dino's dad? Because Dino's dad did switch before. Dino's dad maybe voted Labour for the Labour Party for a while, but that cultural bond broke, and that gave the Conservative Party took them over 40% in 2017 and then in 2019. But I think ultimately I would sort of say that surely you've got to have both. Like we were talking about the alternative coalition of voters for the Conservative Party going after sort of liberal graduates living in urban areas. I don't know why you would go for those voters over a young family who live in any town across the country, whether it's Scotland, Darlington, the southeast, anywhere, whose interests are essentially conservative. Like they want a party to represent them. They don't want to be patronised. They want to protect the wealth that they've got. Like, I don't know why you wouldn't go for those, or why you choose the other coalition, even if you could.
Well, I guess the problem that we've got at the moment is, so first of all, Dino's dad, to keep going on this family, he's the person who can't get the hospital appointment, is worried about the ambulance not turning up, and meanwhile, Dino is the guy who is struggling to afford his house, struggling with interest rates. So again, this comes back to this idea that it is economics as opposed to social reasons, because socially, both Dino and his dad are people who will be more akin to the Conservative Party, where it says even how Keir Starmer has changed things. So again, this comes back to this economic issue of just trying to make the state, the public realm work better. And once you do that, it then opens up the door to them to naturally sort of, coming home in a way.
I mean, it seems to me that Dino's dad is more likely to vote Conservative the next election, more likely to stay. But that route to maintaining power is getting back to kind of that 35% strategy. That's a more limited ambition for the party. But I don't see any, or I don't see many retail policies aimed at Dino and his family. Like going back to Blair, the kind of things where you'll see a doctor in this, this many hours, this many days, guaranteed appointment, guaranteed class sizes. I guess that's why this idea of going back to Help to Buy is being raised all over again, because it's a policy aimed at a specific cohort that you're struggling with that might get you over the line. I'm not necessarily a fan of that policy, but at least it's aiming at somebody. I think more policies like that or retail policies would help.
And I think when we get more towards the election, there will definitely be that. Now, I'd like to throw this open here to Dino or his dad, if he happens to be in the room. We've got Aaron, who's got the microphone, who's going to run round here. And this is meant to be a debate, so please challenge us with ideas. If you disagree with anything in the panel, and if you could just say who you are and what brought you along here tonight. We'll start with the lady in the front row here, please.
Cox. I was a lead writer at the Telegraph and a councillor here in Westminster for many years. Here's an offer for Dino when he hasn't yet bought his house, and you mentioned Help to Buy being canvassed again. Why don't we put state subsidy into remediation of brownfield land? That way we keep Dino's dad happy, who doesn't want greenfield sites built on, and they're unsustainable and car dependent anyway. We increase the supply of brownfield land, could well be in the southeast where it may most be wanted, and it doesn't give you the problems that you get with Help to Buy. Is this something that anybody has suggested?
Fancy idea. Eddie, do you want to take that one?
Well, I mean, we've got significant money going into brownfield, but I'm again talking parochially. So the Mayor of the West Midlands has been given hundreds of millions of pounds to remediate sites. And with regard to my most recent Levelling Up fund allocation, we've been given the money. So we can do two things. We can compulsory purchase a site that has been derelict for an extended period of time and the owner has been expecting an unrealistic value for it. So we compulsory purchase it and then we clean up the site, remediate it and build some houses on it. And that's in the town centre and has been blighting the town centre. So I would be an enthusiastic advocate for that, not least because those sites already have lots of the associated services in terms of access roads, good transport links and things like that. So why would you be starting again somewhere else where you need to provide that infrastructure rather than working with the areas that already have it? And as you say, won't meet any resistance because almost certainly what you're replacing them with is better than what exists at the moment.
And Tom?
I think there is. I think Danny Kruger and a few other Conservative MPs are thinking in that area, actually. The ideas around councils being able to buy land, I think similarly to what you're saying, but then become the freeholder and allow people to build those houses on it for cost price, so that the price of houses would go down, and then presumably you could then attach certain conditions on who could buy it, local families or
covenants,
public sector workers or whatever it is you want to do.
And I think
first-time buyers.
And I think this actually speaks to something else about the Realignment Coalition, which is a different economic pragmatism. That there was some research done by, I think it was the LSE, which looked about where the average party voters' economic views are compared to their voter base and the average voter. And the Conservative MP is so far off the scale from the Conservative voter compared to the Labour MP, shows that if you want to keep this coalition, you've got to be much more kind of pragmatic about how you do stuff and less ideological. Is that fair, Rachel?
There are definitely some things I know where the Conservative MP is quite a long way from the mean voter in their constituency, and building is definitely part of that. So renewable energy is another really good example. And I think it is definitely true that if you're going to get over some of the tensions that exist in housing policy, you need to persuade people that effectively their families or equivalent are going to benefit from new housing in an area. I'm not a housing expert, so others may correct me. I have not seen any convincing numbers to suggest that brownfield only would be enough to cope with the supply needed, particularly with the rate at which the UK population is increasing. So it seems to me a sort of good and rather than or, but I know there are housing experts in the room, so they can correct me.
Great. Let's go. Oh my word, we're getting quite a lot here. Let's go.
Five housing experts.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
put up
Alex is one.
Put your
Yeah.
hand down if you're a housing expert. No, please don't. Can we go for this? Can we actually just try and take two because you're nearby? These two gentlemen on the end of both these rows.
Hello. One thing that always stands out to me is...
You need to tell
Say
us
who you are,
and
sorry.
what
I'm
you're
Alex
doing here.
Morton. I worked for the Institute for Economic Affairs, and before that, the Centre for Policy Studies. The Conservatives only have won elections since...
And was David Cameron's housing advisor.
And was David Cameron's housing advisor. The Conservatives have only won majorities since 1992 twice, in 2015 and 2019, both of which were Brexit elections in one form or another. 2015 because there was a referendum promise that was done in response to the UKIP massive swings in 2014, and the Tory party would not want a majority, the small majority, without that. And 2019, of course, to get Brexit done. So that implies that there was a rather long-term problem in the Conservative Party, that they haven't been able to win a proper majority in 1997. I'd be interested to know if you think that analysis is correct, and if so, what next? And then secondly, very quickly, what coalition in another country of the centre-right do you want to see? So looking abroad, the centre-right's in turmoil everywhere. They're Republicans in France, Trump's taking over the Republicans, all that kind of stuff. Which country would you look at and say, I want their coalition of voters and the part, like that group, Maloney, Trump, whoever it is, someone from the centre-right, and it could be small countries or big countries, but I'd be interested to know who you think is doing it well.
Two great questions, and just from the gentleman behind.
Thank you. It's Freddie Hayward from the New Statesman. I think Rachel has touched on this, but I want to ask about Keir Starmer and the progress that he made last week with some Leave voters. And my question really, and I agree that the retail policies aren't there yet, but my question is whether Keir Starmer is the heir to Boris Johnson.
Oh, very good. OK, let's take those two sort of Brexit things together, because I think this is actually a very interesting question. And again, Eddie, I'll come to you on this one first, because obviously, as Alex said, the promise in 2015 played a big role in dampening the UKIP vote, and that a lot of those seats that we won in 2015 wouldn't have been won if it hadn't been for that, even there were 4 million UKIP votes. And there's no doubt that Get Brexit Done was a pretty genius slogan, because it was not just the Brexit votes that had gone off to UKIP and the Brexit Party, but it was Tory Remainers as well, by saying, get Brexit done, aka get this bloody thing out of my news headlines and out of my life. So that worked very effectively. Is that going to play any role in the future? And, you know, what is the Brexit of the next election?
Well, for a start, Alex is obviously right statistically with regard to the two dates that he mentions. But we're in a very weird process in as much as Rishi has taken over. He's only been the Prime Minister for 6 or so months, and yet we're judging him as if he's been in power for a considerably longer period. So he's got his 5 pledges, his kind of offer to stabilise things for the country at the moment. That's certainly not going to be our retail offer, but it gives us the opportunity for Rishi to demonstrate that he can deliver on promises to the electorate and deal with what polling is telling the party are key issues.
Just on that, Eddie, but that may be true, but what will voters think of that? Will they look, OK, here's the beginning of the Sunak government, or do they go...
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, so just to make the case for him, he's currently trading on somebody else's Queen's speech. He'll have his first King's speech in September, October, November, sometime in the autumn. His opportunity to put his stamp on the legislative programme. He gets another opportunity at a big fiscal event. Either he gets to introduce some things in the autumn statement, or he gets another budget. And finally, he gets an opportunity to do a reshuffle. So when you combine those 3 things, he's kind of drawing in the attention, but what he needs to go with all of that is some vision, some kind of proper lead me to the promised land Brexit-y thing that gives him the headline that people say, I understand in a very simple manner what this guy means and what it's going to deliver for me and my family in the future. But what I'm saying is, give the guy a break. He's 6 months in. He hasn't even had a King's speech. He's got a few opportunities on the road ahead. If he doesn't maximise them, we're going to be in trouble.
And it feels like the sort of the phase 1 has been just competent government, just showing to voters that we can actually run a country again.
Things like the Windsor Framework, which I think was genuinely unexpected for him to tackle such a thorny issue so early on and risk significant political capital at that time.
Totally, and I think I wrote about this in a column where it was like, Rishi, the problem solver, is the image that the government is trying to put forward.
It's a good start.
But there is a phase 2, and I think that's where people are going to sort of speak to, and this comes to your point there. To your second point, Alex, to Tommy, international comparisons here.
Difficult question.
It is a difficult question, but it is interesting that if you take Germany, for example, their centre-right movement has long been split in 2, that has 2 political parties that speak to almost different ends of the CDU and CSU of that coalition. If you look at the various ups and downs of Conservatives in Canada as well, if you look in Australia as well, where the Conservative, the Liberal Party there has suffered from the Teals, which are in some ways are a certain element of what were part of the Conservative coalition. That fragmentation kind of is there. I think the difference, I'd say, in the UK perhaps, is that the Conservative Party has always been a much broader and bigger coalition and has been very good at adapting and encompassing a coalition within it as opposed to without it. And the first only real challenge to that, I think, was probably the UKIP era.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were speaking, all of those in all of those countries, the centre-right is currently out of power, right? It's lost in every one. I suppose when I was thinking about your question, I was trying to work it through. I mean, in the States, I think Trumpist republicanism without Trump is potentially quite popular in the States. DeSantis is pretty popular in Florida. In Poland, obviously, there's a kind of centre-right party that's illiberal, has support for welfare policies, support child benefit policies, things like that, that I can imagine certain bits of the Conservative Party here could get behind and would be popular among the current coalition or the 2019 coalition of voters. I can imagine something like that. I don't think it's without hope, or there is nothing out there in the international internationally that suggests that conservatism can't assemble a coalition. On the question of whether Keir is the heir to Boris, I don't think I would put it like that, but I think it's smart. I mean, I think though the challenge for the Conservative Party is whether there is a loser's premium from the Brexit wars. They're actually, having opposed it, they kind of get the best of both worlds of now that Brexit is more unpopular than it is popular, they are seen to have been in the right on that without having to oppose it any longer, without having to suggest that they're going to reverse it and all of the chaos that would ensue from that. So they kind of get the best of both worlds by just saying, yes, we accept it, but you kind of, among their voters, you know we were right. So I think that's the danger. Are they kind of, do they benefit from all the wars that have happened without being? I don't think that he is Boris Johnson.
And Rachel, just briefly on the Boris Johnson Keir Starmer point.
It's hard to align them in your head, isn't it? I'm trying to think what Shakespeare character Starmer would be against Falstaff, and I'm coming up short. So I think I may not be understanding the premise of your question, but I suppose the first thing I'd say is seems to me that Boris was at best the sort of fourth factor in the 2019 election after Brexit not being Corbyn and the kind of core promises. So I think we sometimes overdo the extent to which he sort of personally won it, and the polls don't really back that up. Although people did find him, particularly after prorogation, they were convinced he would do what it took. They thought he was a strong leader, which is, again, I'm not sure that's how they think of Starmer. I'm not sure I am understanding the premise of your question. I think more than that, though, kind of connected to this Leave point that seems to be important to understand is Brexit's just not really that much of a factor anymore. It's not that Leave voters are going to Labour. It's that people in areas where Labour is the second party are going to Labour because issues that have nothing to do with Brexit have massively trumped the economy, the NHS. So I'm not sure there's a huge Brexit dividend in either direction for most voters anymore, because it's just a tertiary concern for most of them. What I think is true, and I don't think Starmer is the heir yet, maybe he will become so, is that if Brexit was a vote for change, we have had enough, there is still a desire for someone who exemplifies that change, and we have had enough and it will be different. It's not obvious to me Starmer is that person yet, but maybe he will become so. So that's a long way of saying no, but maybe because I don't understand what you mean by the heir to Boris.
Thank you. Let's try and get some now. I'm going to ask Aaron to run over to this side of the room here so we can get some ears. So can we just take these two in the front row, and then we're going to come to the very enthusiastic gentleman at the back there. So these two here, please, and keep your questions nice and short and sharp so we can get through them.
Hi, thanks. I'm Peter Campbell, Head of Public Affairs at a small trade association based here in Westminster. My question, I think, probably is more in Rachel's wheelhouse than the other two, but I'd be interested in their views. And that's that we've been talking a lot about Labour nipping at the heels of the sort of old Red Wall and things like that. We've not talked any about the Liberal Democrat impact in the South in particular. So I'd be interested to know, Rachel, is that part of the picture in all of this, or is that just a one-off trend, a protest vote, tactical voting, whatever you think? Because I think, you know, in a general election context where 2-3 percentage points might make all the difference, the Lib Dems taking some votes off of the Conservatives might make a massive difference.
Very good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben Green, I'm one of Rachel's mythical Surrey Conservatives, and as of Friday, a councillor in one of the only 4 remaining Conservative-held councils in Surrey. I would be interested in the panel's view on the proposition that the reason we are losing is because we're playing Labour's game and we're losing at it because they're better at their own game than us, which is we're saying we're going to take a bunch of your money and we're going to spend it on all this cool stuff, so you should vote for us. And Labour are much better at saying we're going to take all your money and spend it on a bunch of cool stuff than we are. And didn't we used to have a different proposition?
Both very questions actually knit together. I'm actually going to take the Lib Dem one, and I want to throw this actually on to Eddie first of all, which is that if you look at the realignment and you're saying you're focusing on trying to nail Labour, who are the main challengers in Warsaw and other parts of the Midlands there, you know, the flip side of that is the Lib Dems have obviously come back stronger from where they were in 2019. Is that a trade-off that has to be made, and can it be sort of tempered in any way?
Well, I certainly don't think it's a trade-off that we should be accepting, although we hear people like Simon Clarke saying that what we definitely shouldn't be trying to do is out-NIMBY the NIMBYs and going along with the Lib Dem premise that you shouldn't build anything in anywhere where people like their houses and don't want anything built, because actually their children and their grandchildren won't have anywhere to live. So somehow, but we saw the tension of our housing policy when it was trying to get through the reality of the voting lobby, and clearly some of our colleagues took a very muscular view and were able to get the government to change tack. So somehow we need to make sure that we do enough to address some of the concerns of the Lib Dems and kind of win back some of those voters, but accept the fact that that's definitely going to cause us some tension internally in the party. And I guess Rishi will need to decide how brave he wants to be and where he needs to kind of put his flag in the ground as to which colleagues he might be causing the greatest tension with in the run-up to the next election.
Tom, and on this point about the kind of overall offer, and this does feed into housing as well, that to the gentleman's question, if you were to go for a much more almost classical conservative, it might be much more, we're going to cut your taxes and roll back state spending. You know, that is, I guess, part of what Liz Truss's pitch was in some extent, was to go back to a more simpler, straightforward thing, combined with a more clearer offer on house building. Now, is there any viable coalition for that as opposed to what we're talking about here?
I'd say good luck with that if you're going to pursue that. I mean, all Conservative leaders take people's money and spend it on cool stuff. That's part of the job. You have to do that. I mean, what you spend it on. I mean, Margaret Thatcher spent it on the military or on the NHS. She didn't particularly reform the NHS, right? So I think it's just the job of government to make sure that the NHS is functioning. You can reform it, and you probably need to do more reform than what you're doing. But if the current levels of funding are and the current lack of reform is producing terrible outcomes, and you're going to get punished for that. The same, I think, more and more now with schools and police. So the people feel the lack of police on the streets. So I think if you're suggesting that a solution that doesn't involve putting more money into hospitals and police and schools, I think that's going to be a hard sell, to be honest.
And finally, Rachel, you want to come back on those 2 points?
Yeah, I think they're both great questions. And I should actually echo something that Eddie said, which is, you know, we've all been very down on the Conservative Party. I do think that Rishi Sunak has done an extraordinarily competent job in his first 6 months. And one of the consequences of that is, as a leader, he is doing relatively well, and I think does appeal to a relatively broader spectrum, including people who've gone to the Lib Dems than any of his predecessors did. I just would like him to now accelerate a little bit. But to your point, I agree with Tom that I think it is very difficult to have a majority electoral coalition that doesn't involve quite high public spending. However, I think one of the interesting things about now is we're actually spending quite a lot of public money. The NHS is now really quite close to many of its European peers. We have put vast sums of money into it in the last few years. What we have as a result is worse outcomes. So it's not that I think the Conservative government has gone wrong in putting money into the NHS. David Cameron put money into the NHS. Everybody puts money into the NHS. It is that I think there has been a loss of attention, partly because of these constant switches in government, about how you get the most out of that money. And one thing that actually also unites the coalition is while they support public services, is a belief that there's huge amounts of waste, of which they have personal experience of, not because of particular public servants, but because of the way the system works, and that this is something that needs to be tackled. So I do think that matters. I don't think there's we're going to massively slash all the taxes, we're going to cut public spending by 50%. I don't think people would cheer about that. I do think there is get a lot more bang for your buck that is compelling. On the Lib Dems, I guess this is the great debate we're going to have right now after the locals. Like, to what extent is this a fracturing of the coalition where people are like, you know what, the Lib Dems, I love everything that they're talking about. They're awesome. I would like them to be MPs. Or they're the closest to the Conservatives and I would like it to not be the Conservatives.
It feels like the latter is where we were in the local elections.
My reading at the moment is it's very much the latter. That doesn't mean that they won't go that way. But I guess the distinction I was making was not whether you might end up with a third party, the Lib Dems. It was more that it's not obvious to me that what people are angry about is particularly different in different parts of the country. So it doesn't require a huge choice in that coalition. In some ways, it's harder. It requires you to get everybody back.
And I just wanted to say, to add to both of those questions, from my view, the thing that, again, can unite both ends of this is public service reform, that I think in the run-up to the 2010 election, there was a huge amount of focus in the party, obviously education, in universal credit. There were other areas where the focus didn't necessarily result in good outcomes. I think the NHS reforms, the 2010s, there's very few people who would say that was the right thing to do, but there was thought about it. There was an effort to do that, and it was not necessarily about slashing the money that was going. It was all about outputs. And this does come back to the fact that governing is hard and governing is quite boring sometimes. And instead, we've gone through a slightly personal psychodrama, and the fact we've had, I don't know how many housing ministers, Eddie, you were one of them at one point.
Too many.
Too many. That, you know, you've not had someone who's been in there for 13 years, every day, pushing, driving to get more houses built. The same in terms of criminal justice, the same in terms of all these areas. Doing that, having a serious programme for that, that's what I think can unite both of that.
One minister where that is true, Nick Gibb, and school standards, primary school standards, are one of the only areas where we have massively gone up in the international rankings under a Conservative government.
Right, let's get some more questions in. There was a very enthusiastic guy, a fellow here, who's already got the microphone. He is keen. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. My name's Andrew. I'm not a party political person, but this week I've been running a leadership workshop with executives, and just as a build, if you look at the global standards of what people look for in senior leaders around the world, it's not managerialism. Managerialism has gone down in terms of what senior directors and boards look for. What they actually look for in senior leaders is ethics, values, and vision. They want people to say, this is where we're going, this is where we're heading. The managerial stuff is not what senior people look for. And so I just wondered whether that as a build, similar to the point made at the front here, I don't think having a battle on managerialism, I realise it's very important in terms of people's standard of living. I think it's because I can't see where the vision is. And when I went from being a lefty to being a conservative was when I realised that Conservatives believed in small business. They believed in creative people. And at the moment, I don't see it, unfortunately. And it's really sad.
Thank you. And are there any other questions in that other room? Yes, there's a lady at the back and a gentleman at the back. Can we pass the microphone back there and get those two questions in as well, please? Thank you.
Lucy Beresford. My question's rather similar to the last one, but it's less about policy and more about messaging. And I think part of the problem is that the messaging just isn't really clear. The human brain is both very sophisticated, but it's also quite simple, and it can't even cope with 5 pledges. Nobody can remember what all those 5 pledges are. But actually,
I'll test Eddie in a minute.
The rule of 3 usually works. Everybody remembers education, education, education. So my question to the panel is, what would your top 3 be? The polling suggests that the cost of living crisis is the only game in town for all the electorate, so it doesn't matter what coalition you're part of. And what would the other 2 be? Is it health and is it housing? And if so, why on earth isn't the government putting out that simple message?
Thank you. And it's the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Vinny Raniger. I'm a dental surgeon, work in the NHS. And I feel like in the Conservative Party, we've lost the narrative on the NHS, that we are the party that will support and fund the NHS. So in the next 18 months, how do we win the narrative back?
Right. OK, well, that last one, I think, is probably going to be quite tough. But what is interesting, Rachel, if we go back to the 2019 election, I can remember, I think there was a Daily Mail front page that had the Conservatives are more trusted than Labour on the NHS. And I thought that was an extraordinary moment of that having that crossover point there. I don't think it didn't help that the then Shadow Health Secretary was in a leaked recording saying that their leader was crap at the time. That sort of suggested maybe not a huge amount of confidence in that side of it. But can you see any way of winning back the narrative? Is it getting waiting lists down, proving tangible benefits? Because 18 months is not a lot, given the scale of the post-COVID backlogs, social care and the ageing population.
Yeah, it's a good question. And what was interesting, of course, is that why were they trusting the NHS? It was, we promised you the 350 million a week and we're giving it. And what's interesting now is when you talk to the public, no one believes the 350 million a week was ever given to the NHS, which it was, and more. Well, I suppose broader, bringing those two together, the thing that was unusual about the 2019 election and manifesto is it sort of played this trick of being a first-term manifesto message broadly from a, I can always have to count, fourth-term government. You can't do that again. And despite the fact that it's a new Prime Minister, the only possible message you can give at this point into an election is we started this job, you need to trust us to finish it. It's the sort of equivalent of the long-term economic plan. It's what Thatcher did in her second-term manifesto. So I think the question you have to ask yourself is what job can we say we have started? And I think the government is really betting on two. The first is bringing down inflation, which I think is problematic because a lot of people, when you say bring down inflation, think you mean prices will go down. So I think that is problematic, but that's one they've bet on. And the second, I think, is delivery on the NHS. But what they haven't done is been specific about what delivery means or how fast. The things that people are worried about with the NHS are pretty eternal. It's can you get a GP appointment? And will the ambulance come and will you be seen in A&E in time? Broadly, that's what people care about and that's what your core targets have to be. I do think beyond that there is a need, and there's sort of 100 ways to do this, but it has to kind of flow through and it has to be quite performative to show that you get the problems people have and you're on their side in tackling them. I do think it's a challenge if people think that you fundamentally are aloof. You are not someone who has to worry about the NHS. The sad truth is it did matter that David Cameron was someone that had a deeply personal experience in the NHS, and it really mattered. And you have to find ways to bring that back because while no one ever loves the Conservatives, and you don't need people to love the Conservatives to win an election, you do have to believe that they fundamentally are trying to do the best for you. I think that's something Margaret Thatcher did very well, even when she was talking really unpalatable policy. She talked around being a housewife and in terms of kind of moral virtues translated through economics from her own life and childhood. And you do have to come away back from that. So broadly what I'm saying is it has to be the economy, but I don't think it can be inflation. I think it has to be you can afford more, unfortunately. And it has to be some very concrete deliverables on the NHS, which is broadly GP and emergency. And you have to show lots of ways that you are on it and care. Sorry, one very final thing and I'll shut up for the rest of you. One tiny example that I thought was really interesting. I think this was under Theresa May, but it's sort of an example of what I mean. There was a period under Theresa May where the passports were a mess. I don't know if you remember this. There were like loads of queues. And she sent all of her civil servants to man the queues, and she didn't care whether they were grade 7s or deputy directors. They were going to go and stamp passports. I think there is a little bit of that we need as well to show that we are really trying to do everything we can to be on these problems.
And I'm just going to rattle through. I'm so sorry as we're just almost hitting against time here. Etty, on this point about managerialism here, to the gentleman who does this for a living, obviously, in some ways, you can look at Rishi Sunak as a restructuring consultant, if we want to go into that world, that has come in to look at how to turn something around in a very short space of time with limited resources and a lot of public scrutiny on that. Now, as we talked about earlier, there has been an effort to do that, and I think it's been pretty successful. Otherwise, the Prime Minister would not be slightly ahead of the opposition leader in terms of best PM, and would also not be there or slightly ahead on the economy. But I think we sort of both agree there does need to be more, and there's going to need to be an electoral offer that goes through all the things Rachel's talked about in terms of having clear, tangible deliverables, but then also that kind of bigger visiony thing, as H.W. Bush, I think, called it.
Well, let's face it, he's got a good team. He kidnapped Will Tanner from Onward, which strikes me as a good move in terms of bringing him into number 10 and understanding the electorate and what their needs and wishes might be. But you're absolutely right. This question, though, about those three qualities that you described, maybe you can have them all, but just this is a progression. Maybe he needs to demonstrate one or other of them initially, so to demonstrate that he's got good ethics and that he's a decent guy is the first thing to win over trust. Prove that he could do the job to give himself... Well, of course I would agree with that. But we are going to need to move quickly to the vision stage where he sets out his policy, and that's going to come, I think, not least in the King's speech when he gets to say who he is and where he wants to take the country.
Thank you very much. And then finally, our last thing I'm going to put to Tom here on this point about messaging and these 5-point plans. Keir Starmer has a 5-point plan, I think, and the 1997 Labour card wasn't that a 5-point plan as well. So it was always explained to me the number 5 is 10 is seen as far too many, 3 is seen as too little. So everyone alights on 5 there. But do you think there's an issue with that? And if you were saying to the Conservatives your top 3 things, what would it be?
Oh God, they're difficult questions off the cuff. I think 3 sounds actually right. The three-word messages are, I think, traditionally the strongest. I don't think anybody can remember Blair's 5. Nobody knows what Starmer's are. I don't think they're pledges, are they? They're visions.
Are they buckets or something?
Like
missions, the 5 missions.
Missions, yeah. But I think coming
Very
back...
good political observers on the panel here, you can see.
I think whatever they are, they have to... I agree with both your point about conservatism has to be an offer that's more than just we can manage the same thing as the other side better. Like the policies have to suggest what conservatism is about. So what is it? What society are you trying to create? What side of society do you believe in? What is the good life? I think there are some people who talk about family being at the centre of that. You know, the idea that, like take for example childcare at the moment. I think the policy of 33 hours a week, essentially bringing that down to 9 months is the policy. So if you have children, they're going to be looked after by the state from 9 months to 18, effectively. Paid for. Now I think it's interesting that as a parent, I've got 3 small kids, and I'll benefit from that, so I'll certainly take it. But I do think it's interesting. I'm not sure whether I want that for my children from 9 months, or whether my wife and I might want a more flexible arrangement where one of us stays at home until the kid is 2 or something like that. There's no offer there from the Conservative Party that is, well, actually, the amount of money that we're going to spend on childcare, you can use that to help your mother to come down, because that's how people live their lives, right? Their grandmothers are a huge part of childcare. Now, that's something I could imagine the Conservative Party. That's a dividing line that the Labour Party would find very hard to deal with. But you're in the same area. You're trying to make people's lives better. The other thing that I think is like a dog that's not yet barked is the online GPs, like the private companies that so many people now seem to access because they can't get access to the NHS GP. That is there. That is a part of daily life now that lots of people are using. You don't have to be wealthy to access these things. Like, are these things that the Conservative Party can relate to or deal with, or say, OK, this is a part of your life. We embrace this. We're going to make it easier for you to access. This is one way. We don't necessarily believe that the only way to solve the GP crisis is for you to see the GP in 24 hours like it's 1997. There might be other ways now that would make it difficult for the Labour Party to respond, because ideologically they'd find it difficult. So I think there has to be a bit more, a bit more thought that's gone into this, a bit more, what's the word? I don't know, thinking outside the box a bit, thinking about what values and what kind of society you're trying to create. I don't really see that at the moment. Like, it kind of feels like the Conservative Party doesn't really know what it wants to achieve at the moment. So it's falling back on Rishi Sunak is a nice chap who can manage things better. He'll put the crisis behind you.
Seb, can I just make a defence of 5 points, which is, I don't think it's meant to be a prescription. You're not meant to commit all 5 of them to memory. It's more like a tapas. You kind of pick 2 or 3 dishes that appeal to you, and that's what you see as being representative of that pie.
Very good. And with the thought of tapas on mind, I think we'll bring this debate to a close. And I think talking about where we started on this question about reclaiming the realignment, what I've been struck by from the questions, and thank you all so much for coming in, for engaging in this debate, is that not many people are actually doubting that there has been a realignment. Things have moved on from the pre-2016 era, and it's something that Onward has been on the vanguard of, and why I was so thrilled to join this organisation, having written a lot about this in my past life as a journalist, is that Onward obviously was the think tank that identified the Red Wall, and Workington Man has done so much work in our subsequent reports, including after the fall, about where the Conservative Party's coalition is. I don't actually think there's that much disagreement about that. There are not many coherent arguments against it. Where we've got to is about how you can hold that together and how to win it. And I think listening to what Tom, Rachel and Eddie have said, there are some very clear strains here about going back to some core issues on the economy there, about how the public realm works. And I think it does offer hope here, not just for where the next election goes, but in the longer term, about how you can hold that together and how the Conservatives can be, because the word one nation is a rather bastardised term and can mean anything to anyone. But I think what we're talking about here in this room tonight is a proper one nation Conservative, and one that does spread across the whole country. And I think it can exist, it does exist, and we've heard lots of ideas about how we can get there. So thank you very much, very much. So please give a round of applause to Tom, Rachel and Eddie for this great debate, and thank you all for coming.